Get started. Again, welcome to this week's office hours for ESG and ESGCV. My name is Taylor Bilbrey and I am today's moderator. If you are just joining us, please go to the chat and introduce yourself with your name and the region you represent. And as a reminder, this office hour session is being recorded for the public record. Next slide. How to ask a question. All questions must be submitted in the chat box. Please type your organization and question into the chat box. The team will read questions out loud at the end of the presentation and will provide answers if possible throughout the presentation. As time allows, we will also allow folks to unmute themselves to ask questions live. Alongside our presenters, we also have several HCD staff, including ESG representatives, ESGCV grant administrators, and other consultants who are able to answer questions during the Q&A session. Next slide. A reminder that office hours recordings and a copy of the slide deck will be emailed to you within 1 week. Next slide. For today's office hours session, our agenda includes the following: ESG and ESGCV updates, office hours updates, upcoming trainings, ESG and ESGCV question and answer, and today's spotlight series, right sizing, rapid rehousing. And for the next couple of slides, I will pass it over to Connie and Anthony.
Good morning, everybody. Just a reminder, we're going to keep the slide up for the next several weeks, that we are continuing the work on our ESG state guidelines. These will replace our current ESG state regulations. So that work is continuing, and from all the great listening sessions and feedback that we received from you, they are coming into focus and looking pretty good. So more to come on that. I will now pass the mic over to Anthony.
Thank you, Connie. Good morning, everyone. No real big news this week. We are continuing to process the 2022 ESG award announcements as we receive those from our contracts and legal division. And in terms of the 2023 annual ESG awards, those will be announced on our website no later than January 2024. Next slide, please. Until then, you can always research our webpage for plenty of excellent resources and documents from ESG and the ICF team. Next slide, please. And of course, you can always reach out to your ESG rep listed here, or if it's a general question and you're not sure who to ask, just send it to the NOFA inbox. And with that, I will turn it back to Taylor.
Thank you, Tony and Connie. A couple of ESGCV updates. Reminders for performance milestones. All funds for HMIS and administrative costs shall be expended by October 31st, 2023. And final requests for funds must be submitted to the department by November 15th, 2023. For some expenditure deadline information, we have the ESGCV street outreach and emergency shelter costs. Those, the expenditure deadline for those were 9/30/2023, and the drawdown deadline was 11/15/2023, and the agreement expiration date on those is 12/31/2023. And for ESGCV HMIS and admin costs needed for closeout, the expenditure deadline was 10/31/2023. The drawdown deadline was 11/15/2023. And the agreement expiration date is also 12/31/2023. And for reallocated funds, the expenditure deadline is 3/31/2024. The drawdown deadline is 4/15/2023. And the agreement expiration date for those are 6/30/2024. Next slide, please. For HCD office hours updates continued, we have office hours are now weekly again. Office hours recordings and the slide deck will be emailed to you within a week of the program. And some upcoming office hour topics we have for you. On December 6th, we have housing problem solving. On December 13th, we have Continuum of Care 101. And December 20th, we have Equity 102. Next slide, please. At this time, if there are any questions, please put them in the chat, and you may continue to put your questions in the chat throughout the presentation. And we will pause momentarily to check for questions. All right, next slide, please. If you have further questions, you can always contact us. Your annual ESG reps can be contacted at their individual emails or at the esgnofa@hcd.ca.gov. And for ESGCB, please reach out to your grant administrator. Next slide, please. All right, let's now turn our attention to today's top spotlight series, Right Sizing Rapid Rehousing with Michael Thomas.
Wow, you really got to me fast today. Thank you. Hi, I'm Michael Thomas. I use he, him pronouns. I am a lead homeless services provider with ICF. And I am going to talk about right sizing today. I'll see how quickly I can clear the room here. We are going to talk about a lot of math. And that is because there are a number of ways that you can define right sizing. We are thinking primarily today about how to right size your ESG program at the program level, so that you're considering your overall funding amount, how you're allocating your caseload, and then thinking about the grant life cycle as a whole, so that as you approach the end of that, you're considering, what that looks like for your clients if your grant is ending versus if it's renewing. So that's sort of how we're going to approach this today. You can see there on your screen, these are some of the key concepts that we'll talk through. We'll talk through a budget projection. So, thinking about what the funding for your grant looks like over time. We'll talk about actual expenses and how that interacts with your budget projections, so that you can be as accurate as possible as you move through the grant life cycle. Then that'll kind of take us into average cost per household. And then that's something you can use to drive down into your case management capacity. It'll help you figure out what your case management load is going to look like over time. And that sort of helps determine what your staffing situation needs to look like to handle it. Next slide, please. So a note that I wanted to put up front. What I just talked through is an active process. This is not something that you can do at the beginning of the grant cycle and then just kind of set it and forget it and let it roll for a year and a half, whatever your grant happens to be. You have to review your projections regularly and you have to update them. And that's because anytime we talk about something that's going to happen in the future that we are projecting, we're making assumptions, right? We're assuming that certain things might remain static. We're assuming that other things might change at a rate that we are making a guess on. And all of that is subject to variation. So for that reason, you can't just do this once or even just twice or 3 times during the grant life cycle. You have to have a set pattern for analyzing your projections and making sure that you're making the appropriate adjustments over time. So it is a very active process. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk through each of those things that you saw on the first slide. First, I'll talk about budget projections. So these are initially prepared at the beginning of the grant life cycle, and they typically are going to show projected spend for each funded line item over time. So, if you've got, we'll be looking at an example of this later, but for each line item in the grant, you're thinking, how much of this do you expect to spend in a given month? And then how does that over time reach the full grant amount? Ideally, your projections for this would be based on historical financial data for the same or similar project. So if you've got a new grant, but you had the same grant in the last cycle, you can use that data to make these projections with a high amount of confidence. If it's a new project for you, it's a little more challenging. There's a number of ways you can come up with data to do this. You can talk with other agencies if you have access to them to see how much they spend. You can look at your project application and the level of services you said you would provide, the level of households you said you would serve. All of that can be used to make those projections if it's a new project for you. But ideally, if you can, you want to base this on historical data if you have access to it. what the budget projections do is it supports your initial assumptions of caseload. So if you can project out how much you think you're going to be doing in the months that are coming, you can then sort of figure out how many households you think you would be serving in those months, and how that sort of helps you plan for your staffing situation. The budget projections also help you plan for cash flow. ESG is reimbursable. I'm sure you are all well aware of that. When you are working with reimbursable funds, it is essential to make sure that you have the cash flow to support your expenditures so that you can then wait for that reimbursement, however long that typically takes you to get. That's a very strong point I want to make, because I have worked for a nonprofit that did not do that planning appropriately. And when you don't have proper cash flow, things get really ugly really fast for your finance department. So it's really important to make sure that you're keeping these projections up to date so that you know what your cash flow situation is going to be like from month to month. Next slide, please. So we also mentioned actual expenses. You record your actual expenses each month, and ideally you'd be using those to adjust your projections throughout the grant life cycle. So that first key concept, that's when you're essentially making your guesses, right? You're thinking through how you think you'll spend as you go through the grant. When you see your actual expenses, you should be using those to adjust your overall projections. This allows for accurate calculation of cost per household. So ideally, as you're making those adjustments, again, we'll look at an example of this later, but you want to be using your actual expenses to adjust that cost per household as you go, because that's going to be way more informative than your projections as you experience those expenses. Your actual expenses are going to support your ongoing assessment of caseload, and it's also going to support your ongoing assessment of cash flow needs. When you do those projections, it gives you an idea of what your cash flow needs are going to be. If your actual expenses start coming in a lot higher in a given month than your projections showed, that has a big impact on your cash flow. So that's also something that you have to keep in mind. Next slide, please. So your average cost per household, that represents the average cost to provide services for each household. And it's used to determine how many households you can serve based on your available funding. You make a projection for that when you apply for a grant typically, but then the way it plays out with your spending can affect how many households you're able to serve. So, it's very important to keep track of how much you're spending per household. And it's important to note that when you talk about the average, you may need to make some adjustments based on extreme outliers. And we'll look at an example of that too as we go through this. But it's just important to know how averages work versus medians. We're going to talk about that. But when you look at your average cost, you might need to adjust it. It might not be the exact number that you use for your projections, and that's all going to be based on context. It's going to be based on how well you know your service population and how well you know the population that you actually have enrolled at the moment, and if the expenditures you're making now are realistic, and if you think they will hold steady going forward. Next slide, please. So I threw this in too. You just heard me mention median. So the median cost differs from the average cost. The median cost per household is basically if you take every household that you have served, you have the cost for each of those, and you make a list from the highest cost to the lowest cost. The one right in the middle, that's the median cost per household. And you would use this also, just like average, to potentially determine how many households you can serve based on how much funding you have available. Median can really be used to determine if your average cost per household is realistic or if it's being skewed by outliers. When your median and your average are, within a reasonable proximity, when they're pretty close to one another, then you can figure that's a good thing that you might be able to use for projection. That number is pretty accurate. If your median is really different than your average, that tells you that you've got outliers. You could have some households that are really expensive compared to most of the others. You could have some that are really inexpensive compared to most of the others, or both. but that can skew the average compared to the median. So again, we're going to look at examples of all of this. Don't feel like you have to process all of that in this moment. But that's kind of how you can use median cost per household to determine if you need to make some adjustments to the number you're using for projections. Next slide, please. And that final key concept was case management capacity. So with this one, you're thinking about how many case managers do you have on staff? How time intensive is case management for the population that you serve? That's an important one to think about. It's easy to say we will serve X number of households. If your agency is serving the hardest to serve, it's possible you might be spending more time with each household, which is going to affect your case management capacity compared to if the population you serve is a little different than that. So that's something to keep in mind, and it changes over time. So something to keep an eye on. How many households can each case manager effectively serve at once? And I put effectively in italics there because I've seen this working at the nonprofit I worked at years ago. It is very easy to make a heavy caseload assignment, right? You can give a case manager a bunch of households to serve, and they might meet the requirements. They might visit that household once a month. They might develop a service plan with them at the beginning of their enrollment. But do they have the time to really help that household implement that service plan? So making sure that the case management load allows the case manager to do their job well. And then constraints on case management capacity can be determined both by your staff attributes, so like the size of your staff, the time they're spending, stuff we just sort of talked through, and budgetary considerations. So that's an important one to think of too. As you near the end of a grant life cycle, if your grant isn't going to renew, you're not going to be able to enroll as many households regardless of what your case management staff size is, because you're just running out of funding for that particular project. So those are things that can constrain what your case management capacity looks like. Next slide, please. I couldn't help myself. I threw in a slide on progressive engagement. Because it has an impact on how you are able to do these projections. So, in the words of the National Alliance, progressive engagement is flexible, targeted, and efficient. And what that means is you're providing each household with just the amount of assistance that they need. And if you're doing progressive engagement well, your costs will fluctuate from one household to another. It could fluctuate quite a bit from one to the next. And that's important to note, and that's not a bad thing. It's very, very easy to set up a policy that says, we will spend $5,000 per household. That's what you get for rental assistance. Good luck after that. That is fantastic for financial projection because you can very easily project out how much you're spending on rental assistance, right? But it is a horrible, horrible service model because it will cut off many households before they get the assistance that they need. And what we find is if you do progressive engagement well, you will spend more on some households, and that's typically going to be offset by other households where you spend far less because their barriers are less than those more intensive ones. So progressive engagement is not only a best practice, but it's also a critical strategy to maximize how many households you serve and maintain appropriate caseloads and an appropriate financial burn rate. So you're spending your money efficiently. Next slide, please. So you might be thinking this, great, how does any of that help me? I have my background in this field is in the finance and grants management side of things. And this is typically the reaction we got from our social services workers, like that's your job. You deal with the money. We gave this presentation to our case managers because I think it is important for people at all levels of the organization to understand how all of this plays in with case management and with right sizing your project. If you tell a case manager, no, you can't take on another household, and there's no context for that, you might not get a great reaction there. If your case management staff understands how you are managing the overall project based on the financials and the case management capacity, that sort of thing, that understanding goes a long way. So that is why it is helpful to understand all this, no matter where you sit in the organization. Next slide, please. So ultimately, all of this can help you by helping you make highly informed decisions. I want to throw out the caveat that none of what we're discussing here creates absolute certainty. However, when we make educated guesses based on the best available information, we make better decisions and we're more capable of flexibility. You know, if you set your assumptions at the beginning of your grant year and then just leave those assumptions and you just keep rolling, all of a sudden, if your finances stop working out, you realize you're running out of money, and you've got 20 households enrolled, what do you do then? It's hard to be flexible in that situation. Whereas if you're actively managing this and you understand what the financial situation is, how that is interacting with caseload, and you know that on a regular basis, you're way more able to be flexible if something unexpected comes up. So this ultimately does help you be more flexible. I really want to dwell for a second on that certainty point too. There's a huge desire to create certainty in what spending is going to look like and what household enrollment numbers are going to look like over time, and that's really hard to do. Even the most complex financial institutions out there are making guesses when it comes, like banks, for instance. My first job in government was as a bank regulator. And they use incredibly sophisticated models. And that's the thing. Like, the financial projections they're making are still guesses, but those guesses are based on highly sophisticated models and years of empirical data. So they are making the best possible guesses that they can, and they tend to be highly accurate. So that's what we're getting at here as well. If you make these guesses in an educated way, then you will be making good decisions and you'll be able to be flexible. Next slide, please. So this is what budget projections might look like. This is a fairly simplified example, but this is not uncommon to what I've seen before. I sort of pulled this from trends that I saw when I managed an ESG program at the state level. So I was reviewing a lot of budgets, and I was, approving budget amendments for subgrantees over time and things like that. And this is typical. We had a little more detail in the budgets, but this is kind of like the higher level line items. So I just did it this way for simplicity. What you see here is a rental assistance projection for the year that sort of increases at the beginning and then tapers off at the end. And then financial assistance and supportive services, those have just been spread evenly across the year. That's not an uncommon tactic. It's probably not going to end up being accurate, especially if that rental assistance number plays out the way that you see, because if you're increasing rental assistance, you're probably increasing supportive services too. So this is just something to point out. Again, this is not uncommon with what we would see because it's an easy way to build a budget projection. You put your numbers in the first cell there and then you just drag them across and you've got a budget projection, but it might not be the most accurate thing in the world. Next slide, please. So this is actual expenses. What I've done here is I've put in 3 months of just some numbers I made up for actual expenses. So that's what I mean by you should be recording those each month. I didn't show all of the math on the screen, but essentially what's happening here is when you put in those actual expenses, you have spent less than that initial budget projection showed through your first quarter, through the first 3 months. And based on that, you have $1,128,000 remaining. So the question then is, how do you allocate that remainder across the rest of the grant cycle? Because again, you've underspent. So you now have to increase those numbers across the rest of the grant cycle. The question is, where do you increase them and what are you basing that on? So, some other things to note here. Again, I didn't do all the math on the screen, but if you added those up and compared them to the previous screen, what you'd see is that rental assistance and supportive services are running high. You're spending more on those than you have projected. So the question that you have to think about there is, do you expect that to continue? If you're spending more on it now and you continue to do that, at some point, it's going to have to taper off. Financial assistance, on the other hand, is running low. Do you think that is going to continue? And if you do think that's going to continue, would you consider a budget amendment to move some of those funds from financial assistance into rental assistance, supportive services, or both? There are a lot of factors that can influence how you might allocate the remainder of this funding. One of the biggest of those factors is going to be, do you expect this grant to be renewed or not? If the grant's going to be renewed, then you might want to consider keeping a higher burn rate. You might want to consider more consistent spending throughout the rest of this grant cycle if there's a reasonable expectation that the project is going to continue because the grant's going to renew. On the other hand, if the grant is not renewing, then you may want to taper down how much assistance you're providing through, the third, fourth quarters, because you want to prevent a cliff. You don't want to have a bunch of households enrolled in this example, it's December. If your funding is going to end, then what happens in the next January, right? So that's a really important consideration when you're doing this kind of planning. Next slide, please. So we're going to use the actual costs from March, which you saw on the previous screen, to look at average versus median cost per household. And we're going to assume that we were providing services to 17 households in March. So you can see there on the screen, those were the expenses from March. You spent a total of $73,000 on 17 households. Calculating an average is very simple. It's $73,000 in total expenses divided by the 17 households you served. That is $4,294 average, $4,294 average cost per household. I wanted to put a note here that you may also find it helpful when you're doing this type of analysis to look at average cost by line item as well. I didn't do that here, but you can use, of course, the exact same formula. So if you divide either your rental assistance, financial assistance, or supportive services lines by the 17 households, then you would get that average cost. And that could be helpful for you to look at as well. It gives you a little bit more detail. But overall, based on this, you're spending an average of that $4,294 per household. Next slide, please. So on this slide, we're going to look at the median cost. And this is going to get at that point I made earlier of how median cost can help you figure out if your average is really the number you should use for projection or if you should make some adjustments. So to find the median cost, you first have to list the amount that you spent on each household for that month from highest to lowest. So I made up some numbers here in two different scenarios so you can see how it can be different when you look at the median. So in scenario one, when we make that list of cost per household, so the actual amount we spent on each household, and we pick the number right in the middle, that number is $4,600. So that number is pretty close to what we calculated as the average cost on the previous screen. So in that scenario, there's not a big difference. So, something around or between, or you could even use 4,600 or 4,200. Anything in that ballpark is probably good for making your projections. If you look at scenario two, you've got some pretty low numbers at the bottom. You have some really big numbers at the top for those households. And the result is your median there is $1,700. So both scenarios have the exact same average cost, but they have really, really different median costs. And that's due to the more extreme variation that you see there in scenario two. So when you see that, you have to make a judgment call on what is most reasonable for your projections. So like in scenario two, you have to figure out which thing do you want to use for projections? Do you think that lower cost is more reasonable, or do you think that average cost that you calculated is likely to be more reasonable over time? And you might even pick something in between those two. This is where it becomes a little bit more art than science. You just sort of have to, again, make your best guess here. So, this can also affect how much trust you put in using the average cost per household for your projections. There are a lot of, there's often a high tendency to just use that average. I would encourage you to compare it to the median and really think about, is it the correct thing to use? Next slide, please. So finally, we're going to talk about case management capacity. And this is just, one approach to thinking about case management capacity based on everything we've talked through. So to project capacity through the grant life cycle, we are going to use the actual expenses table from earlier, and it's complete based on the average cost per household of $4,294. So that's what you've seen we've done here. We've completed it based on that. We use the average cost. So this is basically assuming it was like scenario 1 from the median cost. We looked at that, we looked at the average, and we figured, okay, the average cost is pretty close to the median. It seems reasonable. That's what we're going to use. We are also going to assume here that the project is ending after this grant term. So we talked about that a little earlier. If the project's ending, we're going to want to taper it off as we get to the end so we don't have a cliff effect, right? So we're going to make the assumption this is ending. And what we've done here is we've taken the remaining funds that we talked about earlier. That's the $1,128,000 that we have remaining after March. And we've divided it by the average cost per household and figured out that based on that, we have the funding to serve approximately 263 total households between April and December. So what I did is I took that remaining amount, the cost, I'll talk about on the assumptions I used on the next slide, but I allocated that 1.128 million across the remaining months. And I did that in a way that would accommodate 263 households based on that average cost per household, and included a gradual tapering to accommodate for this grant expiring in December. So if you look at the bottom, I added a row here for households enrolled. Keep in mind, this doesn't mean new households enrolled. This means the total number of households enrolled in your project in that month. So it doesn't mean that, in April, we're enrolling 25 new households. Some of the 17 from March could have, rolled out of the program, and then you're taking in some to replace those. Some of these are probably new, but it is a total enrollment of 25, not new enrollment alone. And if you look at that row, you'll see that it gradually increases over time until you hit a maximum there in July, and then you start graduating households out of the project. And you do that in a way so that you're not enrolling newer households over time in a way that will have you overburdened at the end when this thing expires. So if you look there at December, you've only got 3 households enrolled in December. And really the goal there is when this grant expires, you have to have a plan for those 3 households to be sustainable, right? And it is going to be far easier to do that with 3 households enrolled than if you had, say, 25 households enrolled. So that's the overall concept here. Next slide, please. And so, case management capacity. How does all of that help us think about case management capacity? What did we learn from that projection that we just talked through? So I'm going to review the assumptions and the key considerations if those assumptions hold true. Want to really stress that. I talked about that earlier, but you have to be cognizant of the assumptions that you're making, and then make calls on when you need to change those if they're not holding true. When I did that projection for April through December, I assumed that rental assistance would be approximately 60% of the monthly cost. I assumed that financial assistance would be about 10% of the monthly cost, and I assumed that supportive services would be about 30% of the monthly cost. And so the considerations there are, can your current case management staff accommodate up to 50 households simultaneously? Because that is the maximum that this projection shows us reaching in July. Could you handle that? And if you couldn't, can you make a plan to handle that? If you're unable to, there's a chance that you could underspend on your grant, which is not the worst thing in the world. It's better than overspending. But that's an important consideration. How will case management assignments be managed as caseloads increase and then taper off over time? So, you see the number of households served increasing. So you're going to have to make those case assignments in a way that allows case managers to do their jobs effectively. Can you do that at the levels that you see here? And if not, can you make a plan for it? It's also important to note here that based on the variances you see between the line items, you should examine your assumptions. If you look at, I added a column here for variances at the end. What you see is that rental assistance is projected to go over budget, and supportive services are projected to go pretty significantly over budget. But financial assistance is projected to come in under budget. So when you see those types of variances in your projections, you want to think about your assumptions. Do you think that those assumptions are reasonable? And the answer might very well be yes, based on the best information you have. So if you do believe your assumptions are accurate, how are you going to handle that? In this case, the best way to do it is probably to consider making an amendment. And it looks like a significant amount of that would need to be moved to supportive services. And then that move is going to allow you to hopefully maintain the appropriate case management capacity to support your project through the end. Next slide, please. That is all I have for you. Thank you for bearing with me as I went through a lot of math. I hope that was helpful, and I am happy to take any questions that you might have.
We're not currently seeing any questions in the chat, but as Mike said, if you have any questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat or unmute yourselves so that we can answer those for you.
Just as an aside, Mike, you didn't scare the audience. In fact, it increased during your presentation. So
Fantastic. I'm always happy when people want to hear me drone on about math. Thanks, everyone.
I forget that we're using this new webinar version. So if you have a question, you'd actually have to raise your hand, and we can help you with that. Or as I said, more efficiently, just drop it in the chat and we will get some answers for you. Well, no need to prolong the inevitable since no hands are raised or no questions in the chat. We thank you all for joining us today. And be on the lookout for this week's session and the previous session. We had a little technical difficulty with our recording, so we're correcting that issue, and we'll send both the last presentation and today's presentation at the same time. So thank you again for joining us. Remember to respond to the survey that will pop up as you exit the meeting, and we look forward to seeing you next week. Have a good day.